Hey everybody, Gromlos here with another Warzone video. Now, it took me a while, but I'm finally back in action. As I have said in previous videos, I had a lot of real life things to do, so I did not have much time to play games. But in the next month or so I should have more time again and be able to do more content again. And I figured, since I have not done a tank video in a long time, I'll start with that. But there will be more Air Force videos soon as well. Now, the big news for the ground forces is of course the introduction of the American tanks in the next update, 1.45, or Steel Generals as it is also known. So I figured with the American tanks coming up, it might be nice to take a look at the one American tank we already have in the game, the Captured M4A2 Sherman, and see how it currently does in simulator battles, and maybe get a feeling for how this US Armored Forces workhorse might perform when Steel Generals comes out. Also, I would like to theorycraft a bit more about the possibility of realistic events in ground forces. As you may know, since I started flying events in the Air Force part, I much prefer them over the normal queue, and I would love to see them in simulator battle ground forces as well. But for now, let's take a look at the Captured M4A2. Well, let's talk about the M4 Medium in general a bit, and then the A2 variant we currently have in the game specifically. Now, the M4 Medium is one of those tanks that these days often have a very bad reputation. Many people seem to have the opinion that it was a bad design, often thanks to TV documentaries reinforcing this belief. An opinion I do not share. The Sherman is of course a medium tank and meant to be the workhorse of the US Armored Forces, so it should also be compared to tanks in a similar role as the workhorse of an armored force. That would be the T-34 for example, or contemporary Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs. However, many still insist to compare the tank to very specialized heavy tanks that weighed twice as much, like the Tiger, that were completely unsuitable for the role of an armored forces workhorse. But the fact that the Tiger was better armored and armed does not straight up make it a better tank. The development of the Tiger, for example, started initially as a heavy breakthrough vehicle, a heavy tank that would be used to punch a hole into enemy defenses, which then the more mobile, medium and light tanks could exploit. A very common concept at the time. Now, the role of the Tiger evolved over the course of its development, especially after encountering the T-34 tanks. But initially it was meant to be a heavy breakthrough tank, a vehicle that needed heavy armor and, because of its specialized role, could achieve that extra armor by making trade-offs that made the tank unsuitable for many roles a medium tank like the M4 or the T-34 or Panzer IV would be used. After all, the armored warfare concepts of most nations in World War II had mobility in mind, and a tank like the Tiger could simply not have kept up in many of the offensive operations of the war, and not because of its top speed, mind you, but because of its maintenance cycles, reliability problems and short range, and a fuel consumption that meant that the tank could never operate far from its friendly supply lines. And those were all expected trade-offs, by the way. It's not like the engineers that built the tank did not see them coming. They knew such a heavy vehicle would need lots of maintenance and break down often. With the technology of the day, it was simply not possible to make 60 or 70 ton tanks and make them perfectly reliable, and they knew that. But again, since the tank was developed originally with such a specialized role in mind, that was not such a big deal, as the tank would not have to go very far. Just concentrate them in front of an enemy defensive line, break through it, and let the medium and light tanks push on and charge into the enemy rear. But exactly for those fast advances into the enemy rear, a reliable tank is very important. For example, Rommel could have outrun a Tiger with his Panzer 38Ts in France, because they could have kept going longer without maintenance or breakdowns, and later in the war, Patton was often advancing at a pace with his M4 mediums that the Tiger could not have kept up with, so they could not have used a heavy tank like the Tiger most of the time, even if they had one. So that's why I think comparisons of the M4 with the Tiger are usually not fair, as they often focus only on the tank's armor and firepower, without taking other things into consideration, and often ignoring the fact that in reality the M4 was in many situations simply the more suitable vehicle. But of course, in games like War Thunder, things like maintenance cycles, range and reliability don't count for much. But I just wanted to give a general overview as to why I don't think the M4 deserves its often bad reputation. Let's compare the M4 to other medium tanks of its time. Let's start with the T-34-42, a tank with an unlike better reputation, which is interesting as the performance when it comes to firepower and protection is pretty similar for the two. The original M4 had 20 inches of frontal armor, that's roughly 51 mm with a 58-degree slope. Later Shermans had a different front, but I'll come to that. Now the T-34 has 45 mm with a 60-degree slope, and all in all that is almost identical in armor protection for the front hull with a slight edge for the Sherman. On the sides the T-34 has the edge because its armor is sloped on the sides as well. Now for the turret, the Sherman also has the edge over the T-34 in the front, and the sides are about equal. So the Sherman has an edge in frontal armor, the T-34 in side armor. As far as firepower goes, the tanks are also very similar. The M4 has of course the 75mm M3 gun, a good all-round gun that could fire a very effective high explosive shell as well as a decent armor-piercing round. The F-34 76mm gun on the T-34 is very similar. It can also fire a decent high explosive round, and its armor-piercing performance is almost the same than the M3's with armor-piercing and armor-piercing capped rounds. Of course, sources often give slightly different values, but it seems that the M61 armor-piercing capped round was even slightly better in armor penetration than that of the F-34. And that is also the case in War Thunder. Of course, the F-34 cannon eventually also gets APCR rounds, while the M3 does not, but I personally prefer firing armor-piercing rounds with a high explosive filler over APCR whenever I can anyway. Now, eventually the T-34 gets an 85mm cannon of course, but at roughly the same time Shermans with the 76mm M1A1 cannons also start to arrive, and the armor penetration of those two is again relatively similar. But in this video I will focus on the 75mm Shermans, as that is what we have currently in game. Now the T-34 has the better power to weight ratio of course. It has to be said though that the diesel powered M4A2 we have in game at the moment is the version of the Sherman with the least horsepower. The gasoline powered versions all have more horsepower. So overall I would say the T-34 has the mobility advantage. But in a head-to-head fight the M4 has the upper hand because of its better frontal armor, especially on the turret, and slightly better armor penetration. We will see how it looks versus the Panzer IV when the US Shermans arrive, but you can expect the Sherman to have the upper hand in armor protection, again especially on the turret, while the Panzer IV has the better gun. Well, that was a bit of an overview of the M4 in general. I might go into a bit more detail in the future when the American M4s come out, but for now let's talk a little bit about the Captured M4A2 specifically and how it does. So what's the difference between an M4A2 to an M4 or an M4A1? Now the Sherman's designations can be a bit confusing, as one would expect that an M4A2 is a later and more advanced version of a standard M4, but that is not the case. The A1, A2 and A3 designations for the most part only tell you what kind of engine the tank has, and they all entered service pretty close to each other. And in case of the M4A1 it also tells you that it has a cast hull, unlike the others that have a welded hull. The M4 and M4A1 use gasoline radial aircraft engines, the A2 uses two diesel engines and the A3 a gasoline inline engine. Other than that, the A2 designation does not tell you a whole lot, and they all entered production within a few months of each other. But just looking at the Captured M4A2 we have in-game, you can tell that it is a tank that was produced no earlier than late 1943, because it has a completely different front than the original tanks had. Originally the tank had a 51mm armor front with a 58-degree slope. Later that was changed to a 64mm thick frontal armor, but the slope was reduced to 47 degrees. That allowed the tank to have a bigger hatch for the driver and the assistant driver, as well as an easier to manufacture front that did not need the bulges for the drivers and assistant drivers' hatches you can see on the earlier M4s. That armor layout also means that the Sherman we have in-game is less vulnerable to shots coming in from an angle from above than the ones with the old front. Now, the tank is rank 2, but it has a battle rating of 4.7, so it will see a lot of rank 3 matches. Your primary opponents are going to be T-34-85s and T-34-57s, as well as Su-85s and Su-122s. If you're lucky though, it can happen that you run only into T-34-42s, which I think are inferior to the M4A2 in frontal engagements. If you're unlucky though, you can also run into Su-152s. Against its main opponent, the T-34s and Su-85s, it is a very good idea to try to get a height advantage to shoot down from above as much as you can. Now, that is true most of the times when fighting those kind of vehicles, but when driving the captured Sherman, it is more important than when driving a Panzer IV, for example, because the Panzer IV has a higher penetration gun. The T-34 of course relies on its heavy sloping for armor protection, and that protection increases exponentially with the amount of slope. So if you have a tank with a very high slope, a few degrees change one way or the other will make a very large difference. So even having a bit of a height advantage versus a T-34 will have an impact and make it far easier to penetrate its hull armor. Here the M4 also gets some help from its construction. The tank is very high. That is because the tank in many variants uses radial aircraft engines, which take up space, and the drive shaft is mounted very high in the tank and slightly diagonal. So the M4 as well as other American tanks like the M3 medium and light tanks need to be rather high so that the turret basket can clear the drive shaft. Now, that construction has advantages as well as disadvantages. The disadvantage obviously being that it makes it a bigger and easier to see target. The advantage in case of the captured Sherman is that you will usually fire down at an angle if you fire at the hull of a T-34, as your tank is higher, which reduces the effective angle of the T-34's armor and helps you penetrate it. That of course only works versus tanks that rely heavily on sloping for their protection. It won't work against the KV-1, and it will also not work against many of the German tanks the M4 will face when the US version arrives. But then again, Panzer IVs have a very weak turret armor, so you should not need any tricks to get through that. And with its current battle rating, I would assume that the M4A2 won't run into Tigers or Panthers a whole lot. At least not in the version with the 75mm M3 gun. There is of course also a M4A2 with the 76mm M1A1 cannon in the US tech tree, which I assume will meet mostly Tigers. Anyway, from my current experience versus USSR tanks, and from what I expect it will face when it fights the Germans, I would say the tank will be very competitive. So that's a bit of an overview on the Sherman. Now let's talk a little bit about realistic matchmaking in events. Now, as I have just said, I don't expect the 75mm Shermans to run into Tigers or Panthers that often, with the battle rating difference they have at the moment, and there will certainly be a lot of people that argue that they should, as they did meet in reality as well. And that brings me to the other topic I would like to discuss in this video, and that is my opinion on realistic matchups in ground forces, as well as some theory crafting on how events could be used to achieve realistic matchups in simulator battles. Now, as you might know, I prefer events in the Air Force part of the game over the normal queue, and more realistic matchups is one reason for that. However, I think that in ground forces, events are both more necessary for realistic matchups, but also require a more complex version of the events to do it right. Now, let me explain why. First of all, while I prefer events in the Air Force part of the game, I have said in the past that I think realistic matchups would work for the most part fine in the normal queue in simulator battles as well. No plane is immune to weapons fire even of an inferior opponent, and since there is no radar or name tags, a weaker plane can sneak up on a more powerful opponent in a way that simply can't be done in other game modes. That's why I think historic matchups, as they are usually called, would work fine in the simulator battle Air Force queue, with some notable exceptions of planes that were far ahead of their time, like the M8262. But planes are not tanks, and there are major differences between ground forces and air forces in the game, and those differences lead me to the opinion that in the ground forces part of the game I don't think historic matchups would work well or at all in the normal queue, even in simulator battles, though they might in events with some changes to the system. Well, what makes me think that historic matchups won't work in the normal queue? First, if you look at the air forces, you will notice that there will usually not be many fighters of a similar layout in production by the same country of vastly different capabilities at the same time. If, for example, a new Bf-109 was developed, it replaces its predecessor in production. Same goes for planes on the other side as well. A new 109 entered service, so the British introduced a new Spitfire variant that replaces the old one shortly after, and so on. So planes that were introduced in a similar time frame and had a similar role usually had a somewhat comparable performance. They were usually a good match. For tanks, this is not necessarily the case. As I said earlier, the Tiger was a specialized vehicle. It never replaced the Panzer IV or the Panzer III. Both of them were still in production after the Tiger entered service. So, with tanks you have the situation where tanks that entered service in 1942, like the Tiger, are still better armed and armored than tanks that were produced in 1945 by the same country, like a Panzer IV Ausführung Je. You just don't have that with air forces. The Germans did not build a fighter in 1942 that was stronger than one they built in 1945. Also, in simulator battle air forces, you can sneak up on enemy planes that are more advanced than yours. In ground forces, flanking an opponent and getting the weaker side armor of, say, a Panther is much harder to do, as it often pretty much requires the player you try to flank to simply not look at the minimap icons. Now, it has been said that the minimap icons will be removed from simulator battle matches eventually, but I would not expect this to happen anytime soon. There's a reason why the minimap icons are still in the game. That's that most of the vegetation is not there when you set the graphics to very low. That is the reason why Gachin decided to leave the minimap icons in, and they won't go anywhere until this is fixed one way or another. So for those reasons, it is in my opinion a lot more complex to do historic matchmaking in ground forces than it is in the air force part of the game. Too complex for the very simple queue system. Now, one suggestion that comes up very often in this case is that you could just make uneven teams to counter better tanks on one side. So you would have, let's just say, 5 Tigers on one side and 15 Shermans on the other. Well, I personally never liked huge differences in team sizes very much in the first place, and in this case I can also already tell you that it would simply not work. For the same reason that World of Tanks historic battles did not work when they tried this approach. The simple fact is, most people will play the best tank that they can get their hands on a certain battle rating. So if you have Tigers versus Shermans at a certain battle rating, everybody and the kitchen sink will eventually queue up in a Tiger. Now, the matchmaker needs 3 times more Shermans than Tigers to get the game going, but he has 5 times as many Tigers than he has Shermans. The outcome is obvious. You will sit in the queue forever and the game will never start, which is exactly what happened in World of Tanks historic battles. So I think the normal queue in ground forces is unsuitable for realistic matchmaking. I do have, however, hopes for events, which is the game mode I prefer anyway. But I still think it's going to be more complex than for the Air Force part to make it work. And there's another thing to consider. Those heavy vehicles like the Tiger, they were not just outnumbered by the medium tanks of their opponents. They were outnumbered by the lighter medium tanks and assault guns of their own side as well. All the way till the end of the war, there were just much more Panzer IVs and Stuck 3s and the like produced than Tigers and Panthers. So while a Sherman could in theory run into a Tiger from 1942 onwards, even in 1944 or 1945, it was just much more likely for it to meet Panzer IVs or Stuck 3s. So meeting only Tigers or Jagd Panthers on similar heavy vehicles is not necessarily a realistic matchmaking either, even in 1945. So considering that even in an event that takes place in 1945, Panzer IIIs, IVs, Stuck 3s and so on should of course also be available in such an event. I think that would give the battle a more realistic feel, and in the normal queue you'd expect of course to only see high-tier vehicles in a high-rank game, but in reality it was not just Tigers, Jagd Panthers and co driving around late in the war. Also, having a larger number of those more common vehicles and only a smaller number of the really heavy ones would make them more special in an event. And let's face it, that is something that a lot of the Tiger drivers want, being somewhat special, to imagine that an enemy commander sees them in their scope and goes, "Oh my god, it's a Tiger!" But let's also face it, in the games we currently have in War Thunder and World of Tanks as well, that's just never going to happen. If I play in the normal queue and I see a Tiger, well, so what? So is everybody else on the enemy team, so it doesn't impress me much. The problem, however, would again be that very few people would choose to drive a Panzer III if they could drive a Tiger instead, so you would still end up with the entire team being the biggest tank available in the current event system. That's why I came up with a suggestion a while ago for events where the number of larger tanks is limited. One way I figured this could be done is if you could pick more than one tank. One main choice, which could be a big one like a Tiger, and a second choice, a smaller one like a Panzer IV, Panzer III or a Stuck 3, if the maximum number of the large ones is reached. So, if you want to enter the event with the biggest tank available in this event, you have to pick a smaller second choice. If you are lucky, you get to drive the big one, if not, you have to drive a smaller one. Now, since I originally made this suggestion, I thought a bit more about it and I have a few additions to it. It would of course be unfair if someone expects to get the reward of say a rank 4 tank which he queued up in, which he wants to gain experience to unlock a rank 5 for example, but then only drives say a rank 3 tank, which gives much less experience towards the rank 5 tank. So you should always get the rewards you would have gotten from your primary choice, in my opinion. In general, I feel that in an event mode, in the Air Force part as well, the difference in rewards from ranks is unnecessary. It makes sense in the normal queue to prevent people from grinding jets by seal clubbing new players in biplanes, but in the event mode there are no ranks as such. You will face the same opponents no matter what you pick, and it's therefore in my opinion not necessary to have the experience earning difference between the ranks. But back to the tank events. I also think that the module XP should go towards the tank you have chosen to drive. Again, not to make it unfair toward people that want to unlock a module on their Tiger for example, but only get to drive a Panzer IV. And also get a bit of an experience boost if you drive the smaller tank to make up for the firepower difference, so that you can reach a somewhat similar result in rewards. So, that's my idea how to make an event for ground forces with actual historic matchups work, without having to rely too much on number differences. Well, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was entertaining, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.